So we're really delighted to have you here tonight for the launch of Origins and Legacies, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, a project developed by the Nicholl to mark the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. We hold the definitive archive here in the Nicholl of the Troubles since 1968, and this collection of approximately 350,000 items is the biggest in the world in relation to Northern Ireland. You will have seen the exhibition in relation to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and panels and artefacts from our collection on your way up the stairs tonight, and this will be in place all of April and all of May. We would like to thank Oma Museum and Northern Screen for their contributions also to the exhibition. I would particularly like to thank Melissa Bird for leading on the project, and you'll see that from the exhibition tonight, and all of the staff in the Nicholl who have supported her, but particularly Samantha and Annie. Nearly half of the population of Northern Ireland today were under 18 or hadn't even been born when the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was signed and endorsed by referendum. Politicians from this generation share their thoughts and experiences on the impact of the agreement and its legacies today. On behalf of the Nicholl, I would like to address a warm welcome to all of our panellists here tonight and to Seamus McKee, who unfortunately we seem to rope them into these things all the time. I would also like to thank National Lottery Heritage Fund in Northern Ireland, our funders, for their support in this project. We've also left on your seat tonight an evaluation form and the programme of events that it will continue over the next few weeks. Most of them are fully booked at this stage, but we still have a few places left for the agreement before and after, a flavour of drama curated by Dan Gordon and Ian McElhinney on the 29th of April, which takes place in the studio at the Grand Opera House. And on the 22nd of May, we will also have Professor John Tong and journalist Suzanne Breen for a talk that will be followed by a live poll. So I'm now going to sit down and get out of your way and hand over to Seamus and the panel here tonight.
Thank you, Julie. This is what it's about. You remember this? How many of you have read this? How many have not read it? Many have never set eyes on it. Well, we're going to be learning things tonight, I hope. Let me read to you what is, I think, a crucial page in this document. It's near the start. It's called the Declaration of Support. And I think it's worth reflecting on these words, which were the very first words that people were reading at the time the agreement was made. We, the participants in the multi-party negotiations, believe that the agreement we have negotiated offers a truly historic opportunity for a new beginning. Secondly, the tragedies of the past have left a deep and profoundly regrettable legacy of suffering. We must never forget those who have died or been injured and their families. But we can best honour them through a fresh start in which we firmly dedicate ourselves to the achievement of reconciliation, tolerance and mutual trust, and to the protection and vindication of the human rights of all. 3, we are committed to partnership, equality and mutual respect as the basis of relationships within Northern Ireland, between North and South, and between these islands. 4, we reaffirm our total and absolute commitment to exclusively democratic and peaceful means of resolving differences on political issues and our opposition to any use or threat of force by others for any political purpose, whether in regard to this agreement or otherwise. And the longest paragraph, 5, we acknowledge the substantial differences between our continuing and equally legitimate political aspirations. However, we will endeavour to strive in every practical way towards reconciliation and rapprochement within the framework of democratic and agreed arrangements. We pledge that we will, in good faith, work to ensure the success of each and every one of the arrangements to be established under this agreement. It is accepted that all of the institutional and constitutional arrangements, an Assembly in Northern Ireland, a North-South Ministerial Council, implementation bodies, a British-Irish Council, and a British-Irish intergovernmental conference, and any amendments to British Acts of Parliament and the Constitution of Ireland are interlocking and interdependent, and that in particular the functioning of the Assembly and the North-South Council are so closely interrelated that the success of each depends on that of the other. And finally, it says, accordingly, in a spirit of concord, we strongly commend this agreement to the people North and South for their approval. That's solemn. Those are solemn words. And I think tonight they provide the context for our reflection on where we are 25 years later. And they also, those words, reflect the huge effort, the tortuous effort that went into getting that agreement. Let me introduce to you who we have here tonight. 5 MLAs from today's generation of politicians. As we go along the road, Kate Nicholl is an Alliance Assembly member for South Belfast. Pádraig Delargy is a Sinn Féin MLA in Foyle. Cara Hunter is an SDLP Assembly member for East Londonderry. Phillip Brett is a DUP MLA in North Belfast. And John Stewart is an Ulster Unionist Assembly member for East Antrim. Would you welcome them, please? Can I start with you, Kate Nicholl? What's changed in 25 years, Kate, and what stayed the same? Because you were 9 or 10, weren't you, when the agreement was signed? And don't worry, I'm going to remind everybody of just what age they were, you know.
I said to Pádraig, I was like, what year were you born in? And he said 1996, which makes me feel ancient. Yeah, I was just shy of 10 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, and I lived in Zimbabwe, so really didn't know very much about it or its impact. And actually didn't really know very much about it or its impact until maybe 10, 15 years ago. You know, I came into politics a little bit late and hadn't grown up in school having much of an interest. But I've always been aware that its legacy that it leaves is extraordinary.
So what's changed? What's changed?
Peace. How many people's lives have been saved? How many families have been spared pain because of it? Peace has changed.
And what's stayed the same?
Division, political instability. I think the fact that our children are still educated separately, the stronghold paramilitaries have over communities. There are still serious problems within our society.
Okay, Pádraig, how do you see it? What's changed and what's stayed the same?
Yes, well, thanks again for having us here tonight, Seamus. I think the first thing is just to reiterate Kate's point. I was 2 when this agreement was signed, so as you can imagine, I don't have a great working memory of it.
Yeah, but you know what's changed and what's stayed the same.
So the impact that it's had is for my generation an opportunity to grow up in a society which has been peaceful, which is, I think, totally changed. I think when we look around, we can look at it 2 ways. We can look at the things that have stayed the same, as Kate mentioned. We can look at the divisions that remain, the issues that persist in our society. But we can look at it optimistically, and we can look at the great things that have changed. And my own city in Derry, you know, the regional balance that has begun to shift. We're now looking at an entire generation who have grown up in peace times. And I think that's significant in itself, because what you have emerging now is a generation who haven't grown up through a conflict, who have grown up in a society that they've been able to flourish, to largely get away from those divisions of the past.
Okay, we'll explore lots of this later on, but so far you're helping me by making brief comments, and it's fair to all of you and fair to our audience if we're as brief and concise as we can be, because we've a lot to get through. Cara, what's changed and what hasn't?
Thank you very much for having me here. I was 3 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. For me, I have to stay on theme here. I think ultimately it's peace. My father grew up in a small village called Clady outside Strabane, and his childhood, when he talks about the imagery that he's seen and the violence that was ever present on the streets, I think we're so blessed in this generation, thankfully, to have had to witness that in our childhood. And I think, you know, what has stayed the same, I think that there's still difficult difficulties with paramilitary grasp on our communities. But I think what is so beautiful about the Good Friday Agreement is it gives us the opportunity to work together, to live together, to be educated together, and to give our children and our young people...
Well, not quite educated together.
Well, I think we have a long way to go, but
Yeah.
it's given us the opportunity to really look at life through the lens of respect and reconciliation.
All right. Phillip.
Seamus, thank you very much for coming to invite me along here today. As a swing voter at the age of 7 in 1998, growing up on the outskirts of Glengormley, and I see some of my old neighbours in the crowd here today. Hopefully it wasn't too much of a torture as a 7-year-old. For me, Seamus, I suppose what has changed is people like me from a non-traditional political background have been able to get involved in politics.
It's interesting that you say about your background. I mean, I hope you won't mind just saying to people, what is the background? Mother and father from 2 different political traditions.
Yeah, so I was brought up in a very vehemently yes household. My dad was a SDLP supporter and my mum was a down-the-wool Ulster Unionist voter. And my granny was a great Paisleyite. So I had I had the mixed bag. But the Belfast Agreement afforded the opportunity for my family to allow us to explore our own political ideologies and our own political goals. And I think hadn't we had the relative peace that was achieved, I might not have been able to do that.
And what stayed the same?
What stayed the same, I suppose, from a personal perspective, 1998, victims, I feel, were hugely let down by the Good Friday Agreement and continue, and it's an indictment on all politicians, my party included here today, that victims continue to be let down by the agreement in 1998 and subsequent agreements. We still haven't managed to solve that issue yet.
John.
Well, thank you very much, Seamus. It's good to be here. Just for clarity, I was 15, so I'm the oldest in the panel. I think the eligibility for tonight was 40 or under. I'm 40 on Sunday, so I'm clinging on by my fingernails to eligibility for this panel, but thank you for having me. I can remember the discussions in school when it was going on. I remember discussions with my father. He was an RUC officer at the time. He was serving in North Belfast and Tennant Street, and had lost colleagues, had seen the devastation that had gone on for many years. And I'm old enough to remember that. My first memory of the Troubles was the Shankill bomb and watching it on TV in tears with my mum as I watched them carry the bodies out of the chip shop. So I can remember that. I'm sadly old enough to remember that, but I'm so proud of the fact that young people today don't, and that it's a history lesson for them rather than a reality.
Yeah, but a lot stayed the same.
A lot absolutely has stayed the same. Unfortunately, we have political division, but our division now takes place through diplomatic means and hopefully in the chamber and in council chambers across the country where we can actually get on with each other and express our differences in a positive way. When I was walking in here tonight, though, the amount of accents from all over the world is one of the massive things that has changed in Northern Ireland. This is a place that people want to come and see. Northern Ireland is now seen across the world in a good light rather than a bad one, even though we have faults. And I think that's a massive difference that we have to be proud of.
Okay, I want to just a quick response from each of you, starting again with you. Well, actually starting with you, John. Just a quick response to this from each of you. If you'd been in politics 25 years ago, what would your attitude to the agreement have been?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because I wasn't, and I don't think that I would have been able to fully contemplate and be aware of the pressure that was on my shoulders at that time, living through the past 30 years prior to that, knowing the responsibility that were on our shoulders to deliver what would ultimately deliver peace. But I would like to think that I would have had the courage of my convictions to do the right thing, to lead, to take a step outside my comfort zone, like David Trimble and John Hume and many others did, to do that because it was the right thing to do.
Phillip, what would your attitude to it have been?
I think
Your party opposed it.
they did, and I think the issues in which they highlighted were overcome in subsequent agreements. So I think that although the DUP are often lambasted for the stance that they took in relation to the agreement, issues around support for the police, prisoners being released from prison, those were issues that have subsequently became the mainstream within unionism and indeed...
Well, what would your attitude to it have been, you personally?
I think for the position that our party adopted, there was clear wins within the agreement, but there were improvements that needed to be made, and thankfully they have been made to date. But at that stage, I don't think, in all consciousness, I could have supported it, given some of the fundamental flaws of the agreement.
Interesting. Cara, what would your attitude have been?
Well, I'm the SDLP, so 100% I would be absolutely behind it. Any opportunity for the path for peace, I would back.
John? Sorry, Pádraig.
Yes, again, I'm all about working together. I think it's delivered huge opportunity for my generation, so yes.
And Nicola?
Yes.
Right. Interesting reflection there of party positions that have lasted. So, Kate, saying that, yes to it, had you been there 25 years ago, what's its legacy been? If it was that great, what's its legacy been?
It's going to be a word that comes up a lot, but peace. I find it hard to imagine what it was like then. I hear the stories and I meet people who lived through it, and that's something that I can't imagine. And I can't imagine it because we've had relative peace. So, I mean, that legacy is extraordinary. It is flawed. There are things that, there are problems within our society that still need to be addressed. But
like what?
Well, I mean, the ones that I raised about integrated education, I mean, there are issues in terms of alliance.
People still using guns. Some people are still using guns.
The control paramilitaries have within our communities is the biggest one for me, and it's deeply depressing. We've seen in the news, in the last couple of days, there are still serious issues in our society, but focusing on the flaws, I think it prevents us from appreciating the magnitude of what it achieved. The fact that we're all able to work together, that we have different opinions on so many things, but ultimately we're invested in this place working for people and people's everyday lives. I think the fact that we're able to come together and work on so many issues most of the time, is incredibly positive.
Pádraig, you believe the agreement's been a success, but what's its legacy for you?
Yeah, well, again, just to follow Kate's example, I think if I could sum it up in one word, it's opportunity. It's the opportunity and the chance for change in our society. The thing that underlined 1998 was a new start, a fresh start. I think that we're still to realise some of that potential. I think there's still some way to go. But I think there have been very, very significant changes in our society. There's been a lot of cross-party working. There's been a lot more integration across society. There's still a long way to go in that, but we have to be optimistic about what we have achieved. There's huge opportunities now. I think one of the legacies which perhaps hasn't been fully realised is the opportunity for all-Ireland cooperation. You can imagine, Seamus, that I was going to say that, but for North-South bodies to really work together, and for East-West bodies to work together as well. You can't do one without the other.
Well, Cara, how do you see the legacy of 98?
Well, I see ultimately the Good Friday Agreement transformed our society, and again, it goes back to peace. I think that just we'll never truly know how many lives were saved as a result of it. There's no way to really measure that. But for me, I think it's just given us, this generation, the ability and the capacity to have the opportunities that maybe our parents and our grandparents did not have. I think we still have a long way to go in building on the Good Friday Agreement. I think that we still have a lot of post-conflict issues we need to resolve. I think from a mental health perspective, dealing with things like domestic violence, addiction, I think we have huge issues, and I think the political dysfunction and the collapse of our government, we're not getting these issues dealt with. And I think that while it gave us the opportunity and it gave us a foundation to work off, I think we have very, very far to go to realise
I think,
its true
Phillip,
potential.
freedom to choose is important to you as far as its legacy is concerned, is it?
Yeah, no, totally, Seamus. And I think for me, the main takeaway from 1998 and other agreements has been that in order for them to prosper and to work, that they need to have the collective support of all communities here in Northern Ireland, and that we can only truly move forward when those agreements or the institutions, outworkings of them, do have the collective support of all communities in Northern Ireland. And I think if we are all to look back at any legacy, that's what we should be looking at now, and that's the roadmap ultimately for moving forward from our current political dispensation.
How do you see it, John?
Well, I see, first of all, that we've become normalised compared to every other major.
Semi-normalised?
Semi-normalised. Obviously, politically, we're not there yet. But Belfast, for example, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Belfast locked down at 6 o'clock at night. I'm old enough to remember when Carrickfergus gates used to be put up to stop people getting to the town centre for fear of bombs. I mean, I can remember the adverts, the Cats in the Cradle advert in 1993, when it was perfectly normalised. And the adverts, the tactical terrorism of watching a man walk into a bar and gun the place down, and that was on in the daytime. That is the society that we had, and the society we had now is completely transformed. We have tourists flocking in here. Northern Ireland is on the international map for the right reasons. Internationally, at peace conferences, the Good Friday Agreement is held up for all the right reasons, for transforming society and bringing peace. And for me, that's what it's delivered, and we should never forget that. I mean, I was 10 whenever that advert came on, and I think a lot of people can probably remember it. It was terrifying. I watched it back quite recently, and my son's now 9, and I sit with him every Sunday night, and we watch an episode of Pop Goes Northern Ireland. I don't know if anyone's seen it on BBC, when it brings back 1 year of the Troubles, starting in 1969 up until 2010. And he's horrified. Of course he is, and he can't understand it. And I watch it back actually so sad, but so relieved that we've turned such a massive corner. I think it's all incumbent on all of us quite often to go back and just watch how far we as a society have come.
Did it have an effect, the agreement, on you getting into politics?
Absolutely. First of all, I'm in politics because, like everyone in this panel, and I believe everyone in the chamber, that in the assembly, or she should be in the chamber, that they want to deliver for people. And the Good Friday Agreement made that possible. We had years of boycott and an inability to have developed institutions. I joined the Ulster Unionist Party because of the bravery and the leadership that they showed during that time, and because of the society and the politics that it created. So absolutely.
Is there any way the agreement affected you getting into politics, Phillip?
I suppose the outworkings of it, as we talked about earlier, Seamus, afforded everyone across Northern Ireland the ability to step forward to try and shape a Northern Ireland that they wanted to see. It inspired some people to try and implement the agreement. It inspired others to try and get the changes that were required.
Did it inspire you?
As a 7-year-old, I'm not quite sure. I was probably more watching Cartoon Network than watching the outcomes of joint negotiations or talks.
Later?
But later, I suppose St Andrews was probably the most recent major political agreement in my lifetime, but none of these agreements would have been possible without the Belfast Agreement taking place first
But what got you into politics?
What got me into politics was obviously the murder of my brother after the agreement took place, and I didn't want any other family or community to go through what our family suffered.
I think you've just said something which is very important, and if I could just ask you to explain this. This is your brother Gavin.
Yeah.
It was 2001.
Yeah.
And it was in the Hightown estate. He was standing with some friends. Some people came along who were in the UDA, and they assumed he was a Catholic.
Yeah, I was very fortunate, as I say, to grow up in a mixed background. A community that didn't matter what religion you were, and we just got on with each other. We didn't really know the story of violence. I suppose our parents had moved us to where we were because they wanted a better future for their children than they went through. My dad's from the Andersonstown Road in West Belfast, my mum from Ardoyne, and moved us to the quiet outskirts of Glengormley to try and bring us up in a sheltered background to allow us to choose what political, if any, direction that we wanted to go down. But yeah, we lived in a mixed community. My brother socialised at the local GAA club, and an indiscriminate shooting took place by those who claimed to be defenders of Ulster, but nothing more than terrorist thugs, and killed him. And that was after the agreement took place, and that's why for me personally, when we hear that 1998 delivered peace, it did deliver relative peace, and lives have been changed, but the outworkings of releasing prisoners and the normalisation of violence that in many ways the agreement institutionalised seemed to me that I don't want any other family to go through what we went through, so got involved in politics so that I could show leadership within the Unionist and Loyalist community that just you support Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom, but you only do that by democratic means. Those who want to engage in violence should be still behind bars and shouldn't have released from prison, is my simple view on this.
But has anybody ever been brought to justice for the murder of your brother?
No. A Loyalist feud took place, and police indications are that those responsible were probably murdered during the Loyalist feud. But I don't talk about this because I don't want this to be seen as, a victimhood issue. It's an issue that all of us as a society collectively have to work together to try and ensure that no family, regardless if it's mine or anyone else that lost someone during the Troubles, never happens again.
Thank you, Phillip, for explaining that. Any way, Cara, that the agreement led to you getting involved in politics?
I would say the promise of prosperity that the Good Friday Agreement give us, I'd say for me that probably put me in the direction of the SDLP. I entered politics under the issue of mental health. I really wanted to advocate for improved mental health facilities, and given in the last collapse that lasted 3 years, very important policy surrounding suicide prevention, like the Protect Life 2 strategy, were delayed and not implemented, and I just find this absolutely disgusting. I mean, in Northern Ireland, our mental health issues here are 25% higher than the rest of these islands, and for me that's an absolute priority, regardless of what background, belief that you have. Mental health does not discriminate, and neither should we. So for me, that's the reason I got into politics.
And Pádraig?
Yeah, I suppose for me, look, I grew up in an area which was had a huge number of politically active people. I grew up next door to John Hume, 3 streets away from Martin McGuinness, 4 streets away from Mitchell McLaughlin. So the impact that it had on my community was massive.
Did you all have the same estate agent, or what was going on?
He's very good. So yeah, I mean, look, I suppose I saw that leadership within my own community. I saw the change within my own community from my grandparents' generation, my parents' generation, and mine. And I believe that I had a role to play in that as well. The issues which brought me directly into this, like Cara says, were probably more relevant issues to today. Obviously, that leadership was the backdrop to that, but it was particularly around mental health, it was around education, it was around housing, the issues which people are speaking about now, which we get in the doors. So yes, it did to some extent, but also more modern issues, which I think that leadership allowed me to want to play a role in doing that myself as well.
And Kate?
Yeah, so my grandparents were anti-apartheid activists, and my mum had grown up in South Africa and had not wanted her children to grow up in the same environment. So in the early 80s, they chose to move to Zimbabwe, which was an exciting new independent country. And then, ironically, kind of 20 years later, came here because it was safe and politically stable. So if it hadn't been back here, and if it hadn't been for the Good Friday Agreement, I wouldn't have got involved in politics. And I got involved because of Anna Lowe. She talked about reproductive rights, the environment, ethnic minority communities, issues that I cared about that I didn't see other politicians talking about.
Right. I want to move on to another area. Kate, do you think young people in school here today know much about the Good Friday or the Belfast Agreement?
No. I think there's a bit more about it at the moment.
They don't know very much about it?
I don't think they do. I mean, when I think about my own experience, I went to school here. I moved here when I was 12, 13. I don't remember ever learning about it in school, ever discussing it in school.
That's quite shocking, is it not?
It is, but it's backed up by evidence. I mean, there was an article in the Times which said, most young people aren't aware of it and aren't aware really of the past. And I think that is something we need to address.
You weren't taught it in school or taught about it in school?
No.
Were you, Pádraig?
Yeah, I was. Seamus, you'll know I was a primary school teacher before I took on this role. So, I mean, at that level, the children I taught probably didn't know about it. But to be honest, I don't see that as a totally negative thing. I think it's good that the children of today have been brought up in a society where, yes, we can talk about the past.
Yeah, but there wouldn't be that society if it were not for this.
Yes, well, I think that's important, of course, but I think there's a time and a place to learn about that. The children that I taught grew up in a society where this is embedded in their everyday lives, where the changes.
But were you taught about it in school?
At secondary school, yeah.
Were you?
Yeah.
Well, as part of the curriculum?
As part of the curriculum, yeah.
And were you, Cara?
No. I wasn't taught about it at all, but I do wonder, is it because peace is so normalised now that our children maybe the curriculum, they feel it's not needed, but I wish I was, I really wish I was, and the more you watch documentaries about this time period, you really get a sense of that hope and that optimism from that time, so I do wish our young people...
What history did you study instead?
It was about 1916, and we also...
1916?
World War II as well. I was educated in the States as well, so maybe I missed out on some bits.
And you were taught nothing about the agreement?
Nope.
Were you, Phillip?
No, and as someone who did A-level politics and has a degree in politics from Queen's University, the agreement or the negotiations or that time period never taught.
Well, what were you taught?
About everyone else's politics and everyone else's history except our own. My nephew's a politics student as well at the minute, and he is not learning about the Good
Were
Friday
you taught
Agreement.
about it, John?
Well,
At school?
I lived through it while it was going through, so I was part of
Right.
I was part of a debating team in my GCSE year, and we were actually having live hustings in the assembly, and everybody in my school voted
Right.
in a mock election. And the year after I did, or 2 years later, I did A-level politics. That was part of the curriculum then. We were learning how.
But
the
is there a
institutions-
divide here in the community as there isn't so
would
many
appear-
other things about what's taught in school? Who learns about the agreement, who doesn't learn about it? Is there a divide?
There appears to be, absolutely.
Between what?
Old people apparently and young people. If that's what Philip's saying, I'll remember that one.
Between the
Absolutely.
education sectors?
And probably between those that study politics and those that don't. So I know that my old school, because I've been to visit them a number of times, do teach it in the politics A-level and GCSE years. But I wouldn't have thought the
Are
primary
these state
school children-
schools? These are state schools?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have thought the primary school children or anybody up until GCSE who's not studying politics in Northern Ireland
Philip,
would be studying it in detail or even.
Do you think it's the case that state schools where most pupils are from a Protestant tradition, Protestant Unionist tradition, would study the Second World War, whereas in Catholic schools they study the period which includes the agreement? I mean, is that what's happening at the moment?
I attended Belfast Royal Academy, and it proudly presented its figures at the end of last week. We're 30% Protestant, 30% Catholic, and 40% who don't define as either of those, and that's the way all children should be educated. But ultimately, I think for politics students of now, and the Belfast Agreement was history almost rather than politics, because it changed, developed, and other things came up. So I just think politics students now are learning more about the current institution or lack of current institutions,
Rather than the history of
rather
it?
than the history of it.
Cara? Do you think there's the divide? Do you think there's a whole section of society which doesn't ever hear about it?
Well, I think that ultimately we are where we are because of this agreement. So I think every child should be given the right
but
to learn
they're
about
not.
it. And if they're not, that's a sad reflection of where we are and we need to do better.
Pádraig?
Yeah, well, I would agree. I mean, there's obviously a split. I think I was the only person on the panel who had learnt about it in school. Don't know if anybody else did. So, yeah, I think there probably is a place to learn a bit more about it. It obviously had a massive impact, particularly in my city, a city in which a lot of the people who taught me grew up as second-class citizens. So I think there is a situation in which it had an impact and probably is maybe held up a bit more in some communities than others.
Leading on from that, Kate, and here's the other point of view, that young people will say the past is not relevant to them. You know, it's not relevant to the things they care about. Climate change, mental health, identity, getting a job. Why should they care about the agreement?
Well, I mean, those things are all true. So, yes, those kind of thematic policy issues, of course, they care about. And anytime you go into a school, you meet any young person, that's what they tell you they care about.
Not rather than history.
Well, yes, but it's important. And the reason why I think it is important is because for so many young people in our society, they grow up feeling no sense of hope or pride in where they live. And they should be proud because what has been achieved is extraordinary. The opportunity that was promised hasn't come, and we need to deliver on that as politicians. But, you know, in the Assembly, we have people coming from all over the world constantly. I met with a Palestinian and Israeli film crew recently, and they were asking me really technical details about how the council committees worked in Belfast City Council. I've never met anyone who was interested in that, but they wanted to know exactly because they
Were they still interested when you told them?
switched off a wee bit. No, they were, because for them, that's something that they couldn't even contemplate. And they kept asking these questions. And you realize we have these structures, we have these things in place that we can't take for granted because it's extraordinary we have it and we have to hold on to it. But also we need to appreciate what was achieved so that we have the motivation to deliver more and to move forward.
Pádraig, you've been talking quite a lot. You've been talking, yeah. Thank you. Right, are you related? No, right. Good.
Give him this 20 quid.
You've been talking, Pádraig, quite a bit about schools and what happens there. How many young people who are at school do you come across who really know, not just about the agreement, but why it was necessary? What the need was for structures like the ones I read out at the start, the Assembly, the British Irish Council, the North-South Ministerial Council, the Equality Commission, Human Rights Commission. Do they know why those things were necessary?
Well, I think Philip and John both mentioned a key point in that, is that there probably is more scope to teach it in schools at an earlier age. I think there's maybe an overarching understanding of why it happened, of what it came about. But I think, as well as schools having, I suppose, a responsibility or a role in teaching that, a lot of people have learnt it in their communities and their families and have learnt that particular narrative as well. So, yes, there's also, in schools, when you're teaching these issues, you're teaching children from a large range of backgrounds. So you have to make sure that you reflect that as well. I think while it is important that people have an appreciation and an understanding
of why those things were necessary.
Of why those things were necessary, yes. I think it's also important to focus it on what it means for today. And particularly one of the things which we've seen, for example, during the pandemic, was the need to work together, the ability to work together.
Okay.
I think that's what underlines it.
But I'll come back to that. But Cara, can I read you something the former Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, told the House of Commons Select Committee on Northern Ireland recently? It's carrying out its own investigation into the effectiveness of the agreement. And Bertie Ahern said this: the generations who are now growing up in an environment of an imperfect but perpetual peace are real treasures that the agreement has brought to this point. The generations who are growing up now are real treasures, he said. Far from criticising them as a generation who do not remember and therefore will never understand the Troubles, we should celebrate them as our singular success. For only if we continue to be successful as civic leaders in continuing on the commitment of the agreement can we ensure that they do not have to witness the horrific acts of violence that scar both our pasts. We all have an ongoing responsibility to continue to ensure that this generation's pathway in life is a perpetually peaceful one. Do you agree with that, or do you find it's a very idealistic view from someone who, after all, was one of the architects of the agreement?
Well, firstly, I think it was beautifully said. I would say that this conversation is based around the concept of peace and prosperity in the North, and I think that we need to link that in with investment into our young people. We know the paramilitaries have a firm grasp in our communities to this day. We know that while we're cutting education budgets, youth services, and programmes and projects for our young people, so when we talk about them being treasures, let's treat them like that. Let's invest in the services that support our young people. I think our young people are capable, they're clever, they're creative, and we need to ensure that we're investing correctly in them to give them the opportunity and the platform to do so. And I think that, when we talk about prosperity and what that looks like, I think the Good Friday Agreement gives us the opportunity to firstly learn from our past, but also talk about our future and the right to self-determination.
Yeah, but Phillip, young people are growing up in an atmosphere of an almost constant political crisis here. The Assembly has been functioning for about 40% of the time it's been in existence. So those young people, or many of them, will feel totally disengaged. A high number of them leave here never to return. Where are the benefits of the agreement for them?
I think, don't quote me on this as it's recorded, but I actually do agree with the Taoiseach, or former Taoiseach. Just because our young people aren't learning about, the importance of the agreement, they're actually living it ultimately. They're having the ability to socialise with who they want, go to where they want, have the ability to have a political preference or have none at all, because ultimately...
But they're watching crisis after crisis at Stormont, which is empty now.
They are, but young people, I think, ultimately realise that, and all our people realise that ultimately politics in Northern Ireland works when all communities sign up, work together, and there has been clear dysfunction. And remember, Seamus, when the agreement was signed, the institutions collapsed for a longer period than they have now, and ultimate changes took place at St Andrews. So the Belfast agreement was never the final staging post, but it has been a process in terms of where all communities can politically sign up to a place where we thought we would never get to.
All right. Well, John, we're coming on to the question of whether it's really fit for purpose, this agreement, to deal with the issues of today. And I want to read you something that David Holloway told that committee, the Northern Ireland Committee at Westminster. He's Director of Community Dialogue here, David Holloway. And he quoted page 1 of the agreement, which I did at the start, and he said, those who signed it reflected the positions of people who've been killing each other for generations. And he said they committed to the achievement of reconciliation, tolerance and mutual trust, and the protection and the vindication of the human rights of all. But he said this is what the agreement committed us to when we voted in the referendum, and that is the first, biggest and ongoing failing of the agreement's implementation. It is the foundation stone upon which the entire structure rests, and it is riddled and crumbling. Now, that is a man who should know. David Holloway is Director of Community Dialogue here. It is riddled and crumbling, John. Is he right?
Well, I don't believe that he's right, no. I think there are obviously issues with every agreement that need to be resolved, and that would have, I think the founders or the authors of the Good Friday Agreement truly believed that it would evolve naturally over a period of time, hopefully in a period of not crisis but instability. And that's, I think, one of the fundamental problems we've seen is that we've had crisis after crisis and cliff edge after cliff edge, and every time we have another agreement to get it back on track, it's at a time of crisis rather than during a rational time when we look at how the institutions that Stormont and the Good Friday Agreement can mature naturally.
Yeah, but you don't think he's right. But if you look at, he talks about, and the agreement talked about the protection and the vindication of the human rights of all. A lot of victims and survivors would be asking, where are my human rights? I know where my human rights are, but how have they been protected? They would ask.
Well, I think the way that we've treated victims here in Northern Ireland is lamentable.
It's lamentable.
Yeah, it's an absolute disgrace, and I think it's one of the things that all political parties, everybody involved in politics, should be continually ashamed of, that we have let victims down. There is always a price to peace, and all of the victims in Northern Ireland have not been looked after properly, and I think that there are some in there that have buried their head in the sand and thinking that time will heal it, because many of these people will not be about, and that is a disgraceful position to take, and we need to do more to resolve
that's it, Phillip. I mean, lots of communities that were most affected by the Troubles are still deprived. I mean, they're feeling despair, they're feeling loss, and they're saying to their politicians, we did the fighting, we did the suffering, you got the benefit.
Yeah, and we have never quite got to the politics of reconciliation. We got the politics of peace, but we never got the politics of reconciliation. And politicians have continued to engage in the politics of poking each other's community in the eye, of politics of domination. And I think what we need to recognise, all parties, is that what 1998 showed was that when there is cross-party agreement, that's when Northern Ireland best succeeds. And I think it's an important lesson that we could all work towards today, and hopefully that will be the basis upon which the institution will.
But Cara, I mean, if you're looking at the issues that are the test of the agreement, that justice one, it's failed that test, has it? Or is it simply the politicians have failed the test, not the agreement?
Well, I think you had touched on there, John, things work best when we work together. And I think in the absence of a functioning government, I mean, these are the kinds of conversations we should be having in the chamber and at committees. And it's really sad and really poignant that 25 years, this year, and here we are yet again with a collapse. I think ultimately, when you talked about reconciliation there, I think we have seen some really good examples of reconciliation. Like, I know I was in Derry City and Strabane Council for some time, and there was a bonfire working group, and parties right across the board, cross-party basis, different backgrounds, police, coming together to organise a bonfire working group and celebrate different cultures and traditions, and collectively doing so.
Okay, so am I missing something, Pádraig? I mean, are there changes in people's lives that they maybe don't perhaps connect with the agreement? I mean, what about relations with the police, for example, in areas where there would have been extreme hostility towards them in the past? Can we talk a bit about policing?
Well, I think, just to touch on the first point, the thing here is that there's a basic principle of mutual understanding and mutual respect, which underlines this agreement. And I think that if that's respected, if that's taken into account, and if that's actually enacted, then we're in a situation where we can really challenge these issues, really tackle them, and really deliver for all our communities. I think there are communities which have been left behind, and I say that in the context that we are never going to have enough finances. We never will have financial control of our own affairs within the North. And to me, that really stops us being able to determine what we do, how we best deliver for our communities, because no matter what party you come from, you're representing your community here, and I think that it takes people who live in the North, who understand the North, to deliver for the North. And we're in a situation where we're shackled by our finances being controlled in Westminster. We're not able to direct the finances that we need to really tackle those issues.
You can tell there's an election coming on, can't you?
We're not standing for election.
I want to get you to talk about policing. Because I'm wondering if you take, for example, we're talking about the legacy of the agreement, and as I said, maybe we've been missing things in this discussion. For example, Pádraig, I mean, if there's a case of suspected domestic violence, would people call on the police where they wouldn't have dreamt of doing that before?
Yes.
Right, and why? Why is that?
Well, there's obviously been a huge change. One of the key things that came out of the agreement was a reformed police force. A police force which has been a lot more acceptable across different communities here. I think one of the key things within that as well has been that you can't undermine or take away from the work that was done within communities to make that possible. So there has been a huge amount of work done by the police. The policing board has been a good instrument in delivering that, but also on a community level, whether that's from politicians or from community leaders, I think there's been a huge amount of work on that as well.
That's very interesting. And Kate, it brings me on to this question about what gives you hope, because Pádraig has just referred to communities that he felt or he feels have been left behind. What gives you hope, Kate? Because there was an event in this room just a couple of weeks ago, and there was a woman from North Belfast who was in tears as she tried to express the way in which the past 25 years has made no difference to the lives of the people she was trying to help. She was in tears. Where do you find hope?
There are so many people who don't feel any hope, and it's understandable at the moment. I feel hope because I have 2 small children, and I want them to grow up in a peaceful, stable society and where they see a future here. I mean, I often joke that I'm really worried my son's going to move to Australia. He's only 3, you know. We need to do more, and so it maybe sounds a bit trite, but there is no option. We have to fix things, and we have to make it better, and so my hope is in that. And my hope is, you know, my hope is in us. Like we all get on pretty well. We may have different long-term aspirations, different views on things, but ultimately we're involved in politics. Each one of us is here because we care about people and we want people's lives to be better. So I think there is endless hope in that.
Right. Okay. Staying with you, the last section of this conversation, the agreement we've been discussing, set out a future political framework for this place. How should we plan for its political future now, Kate?
I think we need to look at where we want to be in 25 years' time, what we want our society to look like. I want schools to be integrated. I want paramilitaries to have gone a long time ago.
And do you want reform of the institutions? Do you want Stormont to be reformed?
My party's going to be really happy you nudged me on that. Yes, of course. Reform is essential. The fact that alliance cross-community votes don't count in a cross-community vote, the fact that political parties can choose to collapse it at a whim is deeply problematic. It's the reason why we don't have stability. If we reformed the institutions, we could have an assembly tomorrow.
So you want an end to MLAs having to designate as unionist, nationalist or other? You want that to go?
We want reform in those areas, yeah. Yeah, we want
you want it to go?
Ultimately. I think we have to look at what we want our society to represent. And it's not to say that being a nationalist or a unionist is not incredibly valid and equally valid to my position. But we need to make decisions based on policy, and it can't be reduced constantly to us and them.
This is interesting. Pádraig, would you go along with that sort of reform? No more unionist, nationalist, other. Do away with it.
I think that the first thing that we need to do in that conversation is to get an executive and assembly back up and running. Because one of the key things in all of this is that while we can have those conversations, and many of them are very valid, they have no impact unless we have an executive and an assembly
Right,
there.
well, say they are up and running.
One of the
Say they are.
things which I think has really worked out quite well from the agreement has been the fact that the executive has a balance of people from various communities, whether that's nationalist, unionist or other, and I actually think that's a strength of the agreement. If there are specific conversations, specific reforms, then of course, yes, open to doing that.
Open to doing away with designation?
Well, one of the things is there's a reform committee which is already established within the Assembly, which can oversee, which can allow the option to do that. So I think all those conversations...
No, but I am going to press you on it. Would you approve of doing away with designation?
Well, I think any conversation around how we can do things better
It's not answering
needs
it.
to be had.
It's not answering it, Pádraig.
Any conversation can be had around that. The first thing that we need to do is to get an Assembly and executive back up and running. You look at other conversations around this, the North-South bodies are another example of something which I do think needs reform. Let's have a look at those conversations, but let's get an Assembly and an executive back up and running.
Would you agree, and he's not said, would you say here, yes or no, to do away with designation?
Well, I think that the agreement was never meant to be a standalone document that's unchangeable. I think, it's important to have the open conversation, as you said there, Pádraig, about what the future holds. I think
Just as long as it doesn't change.
Well, like any political framework, I think it's important to look at how it can be updated, refreshed, to make sure it's fit for purpose and meets an evolving society.
Phillip, what would you do? Keep designation or do away with it?
And I'll give you a straight answer. I would keep designation, Seamus, and it might be an unpopular opinion, but unionism and nationalism is by far still the largest political.
What about other? It's growing. You talked yourself about the distribution in the class.
And their people who designate other, their political viewpoint is very valid. As somebody's party who opposed the agreement, the collective blames for where we are now could sit with others, maybe not just our party, but ultimately 80% of the Assembly is made up by unionists or nationalists, 90% of the executive. So although there may be an idealist world out there that some people may wish to exclude unionism from the executive, that's not going to fly. And ultimately, when people come out to vote, they overwhelmingly vote for parties who have a constitutional position.
Right. What would you do, John? Keep it or do away with it?
For now, I would keep it, but like everything, we're always up for
Right.
discussion. But there are obviously changes that need to be made. I think we need to see a properly resourced opposition in Stormont. I think it's long overdue. I know.
Would you rather see a voluntary coalition than a mandatory one, which it is now?
I think even the architects believe that over time that would be a nice way to get to, that our politics would have matured to a degree that we could have got there. But we need to look at how we changed institutions and how we changed that.
So does the Ulster Unionist Party have a view on whether or not there should be a voluntary coalition? Because there was nothing about it in your manifesto last year for the Assembly election.
Well, what we said was that we would enter in the discussion in the reform of Stormont and
yeah.
get into it. So at the minute, we haven't articulated a view, but I wouldn't say that we would isolate that one issue over any other. There are a lot of issues that need to be resolved. I personally would change some of the things that were done at St Andrews. I know the DUP are very happy with that, but I think what it changed was the politics of tribalism in the way, for example, that we elected a first and deputy first minister, and we now see bar graphs in literature
So
instead
you think
of policies.
St Andrews resulted in even more tribalism?
Absolutely, because it was about vote for me to keep another person out rather than vote for who
Okay, do you want to come back briefly on that, Phillip?
I'll allow the muted applause. I jest, John. No, listen, 2007, I was a great swing voter at the age of 15 in 2007. We hear that, the changes at St Andrews entrenched division or changes in St Andrews meant that, because unionism is the largest designation now still in the Assembly, but Sinn Féin have the most seats, that had that not been St Andrews, we would have a unionist First Minister. That's ultimately not the case, because you required the support of a majority of unionists and nationalists, and given the fact Sinn Féin returned the most seats, I can't imagine Sinn Féin were going to be trooping through the voting lobby to nominate a DUP First Minister despite them winning the largest amount of seats. So when people speak about St Andrews, they need to understand the factual reality of the agreement and not just try and think that by throwing out figures that it's actually going to change anything.
Pádraig.
Yeah, well, I mean, we want to get an Assembly and Executive back up and running. Our thing about this is that, you know, Michelle O'Neill has been voted by the people of the North as the First Minister. You know, we can't go back to some sort of anti-democratic, antediluvian society of not electing somebody into a role because they're a Republican. Michelle has been chosen by the electorate of the North. That needs to be respected, and we want to get an Assembly and Executive back up and running.
Cara, do you detect a groundswell for change out there? Are people angry that they're being denied a voice in all of this?
Oh, absolutely.
A change at Stormont, change in the institutions,
Well,
reform of the institutions.
I think that people are rightfully angry in the sense that, you know, how many recalls have we had now? You know, just countless recalls, and many people feel it is just like a pantomime. And they're rightfully angered, and I think in the local council elections, what we are getting on the doors is just people real sense of voter apathy and just anger towards our institutions that can't function. And like
Exactly,
Kate had said, there's real passion on this panel and some really good MLAs who really care, and they're not being given the platform that they're democratically elected to have. And I think that that's just really a sad reflection of where we are.
Do you think that you would vote for the agreement again? 25 years. If it was the same agreement presented to us today, would you say yes to
yeah.
it? Exactly the same words, exactly the same document.
I mean, yes, because that's what they reach. And anyone who hasn't listened to the Year 98 podcast on BBC, it's really, really good. And I think it encapsulates just how difficult it was to reach that. But that, as Cara said, you know, it was never intended to be this kind of static document. It was meant to evolve. And there is room for reform. There is a need for change. It's incredibly demoralising for us. I mean, I feel like a bit of a fraud even sitting here. I was elected in May, and the only time I've been in the chamber is to try and elect a speaker unsuccessfully a handful of times. That's not why I ran for election. So there is a need to change things. But yes, I mean, the magnitude of that and what it achieved and the hope that came from it, I think if anything now, it's an opportunity to refocus minds and build on that, but not to discount what it did achieve, which was huge.
John, a poll in January suggested that 64% of people here would back the agreement again, you know, if there was a vote on it. But only 35% of unionists would support it, would support that document if it was presented to us today. Would you support it?
Well, I still support what's in there, and I'm still proud.
Even after we found all that we found out, you would still support those exact words again?
Well, it's virtually impossible to compare like for like. In 1998, absolutely. I probably...
Yeah, but today, if you were presented with it today as the agreement...
Yes, I would still support it.
You would support it?
Yeah, absolutely. But what I would say is that I genuinely believe if that agreement was up for grabs now, and we were in the position we were in 1998 on the back of 30 years of violence, 3,000 murders, 50,000 people killed, I don't know if the media and politics here would have allowed it to happen. I don't believe it would have been given the space. It would have been unravelled weeks and months before it ever got to the referendum. Because look at what happened when we tried to get Stewart back in 2017, 2018, 2019, on up to 2020. Every time a deal was muted, on much smaller issues than we resolved in 1998 with that and changed the whole society. It was unravelled live on radio stations and on social media. And I don't believe it would have been given the space. And I'm so proud that we were able to do it then and so glad we were able to do it because we wouldn't have been able to change it in this current climate, I don't believe.
Phillip, if you were presented with exactly the same words between those covers, would you vote for it?
I wouldn't, and I think the position that unionism has adopted is saying that we could get a better agreement, and ultimately, whilst it took time and it took space to get there in 2007, St Andrews delivered a better agreement than was put forward in 1998. But I don't think that anyone who opposed the Belfast Agreement opposed peace. And I know that there is an attempt by some to say that because you opposed 1998 meant that you opposed peace. That is not the case. There were key elements within the Good Friday Agreement, that is a cornerstone of where we are today, the politics of consensus, power sharing. But there were clear elements within that agreement that couldn't command universal support, and that didn't mean that you were opposed to peace, but it just meant that you wanted a better and fairer agreement.
But why wouldn't you, given the exact same words today, after all we've experienced in 25 years, why wouldn't you support it now?
Because we've seen particularly as we mentioned earlier, how victims have not been fairly treated from an agreement, how we said we would focus on reconciliation, but instead we've continued to focus on politics of dominance.
And your party's partly to blame, must share the blame.
Yeah, of course.
As much blame as is distributed to all the parties, your party shares it.
Of course, and I probably a rare politician who accepts blame and fault in my role in doing that. But I'm committed since I've been elected to try and work with everyone here to try and show to them that the genuine concerns of the unionist community in relation to the protocol were genuine, that we can work together to get an outcome that can command cross-community support. And rather than all of us engaging in the politics of domination and trying to poke each other in the eye and say, no, your view is totally wrong, my view is totally wrong, there is a consensus that we can all reach to get an executive back up and running that can command the necessary support of the people of Northern Ireland.
Just while you're here, have you seen the document that this panel has agreed that was asked to assess the protocol?
Well, as you noticed, I wasn't one of the...
the Windsor framework, rather.
I wasn't one of the chosen 8, and I'm not...
Has anybody got sight of it?
They have. The panel produced their report to the party leader on Friday, and he'll now take his time.
Will you get to know what their assessment is? What's in that document?
When we will feed into the process, we'll get to see what's in the document. We'll feed into the process of what we're hearing, particularly what I'm hearing in North Belfast.
And are you hearing? Does what you're hearing suggest that you will go back into Stormont, that devolution will be set up again?
Seamus, we've been clear we want to see devolution restored as soon as possible, but it can only be done on the basis that can command cross-community
support. But your
support.
hunch is that you'll be going back in?
My hunch is that agreements that have been previously entered into by all parties and by governments need to be honoured, and if the unionism can command the support in terms of changes that are required, then yes, we will receive a restored executive, which is to the benefit of all the people of Northern Ireland.
We will see a restored executive.
If the necessary changes and outstanding changes that were promised to the people of Northern Ireland take place, I do.
Are you encouraged by what you're hearing, Cara?
Well, I guess we'll wait and see. I think for me, what I'm hearing on the ground is generations of DUP voters who are they're outraged, and rightfully so, because they're struggling to see a GP, they're struggling to go to specialist appointments, and we're seeing cuts right across the board for education and young people. But I do believe, hopefully I'm optimistic that moving forward, that there will be some clarity, just realising how bad things are getting and how desperately we need to get back into government to deliver for everybody.
Pádraig.
Am I encouraged?
Yes.
Well, what I'm hearing on the doors is similar to what Cara's heard. This week alone.
Yeah, but you're hearing from Phillip tonight.
Well, what you've had this week alone, what I'm hearing on the doors is exactly the same as the people want an executive. This week alone, even take education. Education, you've lost Engage, which is funding
I think Phillip wants an executive too.
So do the rest of us. We're still waiting. We're hopeful. Of course we are. We're ready to get to work. We're ready to lead an executive. We're ready to lead a government. I think the other parties here are in the same boat. So let's get that done, because what people have had enough of is cuts. 18,000 children this week who have lost out mental health support. That's shocking. And that could all have been changed by the fact that, when Michelle McElveen left office, she left it with a clear directive that this money was to be secured. What has happened in the absence of that is that we've got cuts from a Westminster government who know nothing about this programme, and a civil servant has implemented those cuts. That's a disgrace.
Well, Pádraig, let me ask you that. Just on the question of whether you would vote for it again, and that agreement has implied consent for union with Britain. In other words, that agreement was an acceptance of partition, until such times as a majority here decided otherwise. Now, would you vote for that again, or is a united Ireland what you're focused on instead?
Well, yes, I would vote for the agreement. I don't accept that that's what it does. I actually think that it gives people an opportunity to freely express and to pursue their own political aims. One of the things about all of this is that 50% plus one has been good enough to maintain a union, and actually the people of Ireland were never consulted on entering into this union in the first place. So what we have now is an opportunity to determine our own future. What we're hearing in areas, and I know, Cara, you're exactly the same, in areas which would never have considered reunification, is this issue coming up that people no longer think that the union is fit for purpose. They no longer see the political, the social, and definitely not the economic benefit of it.
Well, that's the argument to be had. But I mean, Cara, the SDLP is making a big thing at the moment about this new Ireland that you keep talking about. You've got a commission working on it. I mean, is that your focus now, or is it Stormont? Is it the return of devolution? Which is it to be?
Why can't they coexist? Why can we not have the conversation about ensuring that we have, our institutions up and running? But ultimately, when we talk about the Good Friday Agreement and that real important aspect of consent and the right to self-determination, I'm a proud nationalist, and I think our new Ireland Commission is a really important vehicle to get talking about our future. Pádraig talked on there. What we're having now is conversations with people, different backgrounds, beliefs, who never grew up around nationalist communities, never had the conversation about what a future in the concept of a new Ireland can look like, and we're having those conversations. And I will tell you, it is shocking to see there's a huge change going on in society, and I think it's a quiet one, but a lot of people are unity curious. They currently see that our institutions are not working, and they want to know what the future, the concept of a new Ireland truly looks like in an inclusive manner.
Okay, well, I want to give a chance for you. I mean, thank you for the intense way in which you've been listening to what I find has been most impressive in the last hour or so, the discussion that we've had. So I'll come to you very quickly, but I want to give you the last word for the moment, and that is, Kate, presumably you would vote for the agreement, would you, if it were presented to you today? Okay, even though in many people's eyes, it is actually consolidated sectarianism. Would you still vote for it? Do you dispute that it is consolidated sectarianism?
Well, I think there are definite issues within it, and I've already touched on how non-aligned votes aren't given the same kind of equality. But I would still vote for it, and I think that you have to always remember that the genius in all of this was that no one really won. That was the price that you paid. So there are definite issues within all of it. Everyone won because there was peace in the end. So there are things that people are not happy with within the document, but there was never going to be something that everyone was happy with.
Thank you. Over to you. Okay, we have a gentleman at the back who's actually put his hand up 3 times. So, you can have the first go, and I will get to you. Don't worry. Yeah. Okay.
First of all, I just want to say thank you to the 5 politicians. I think it's extremely brave to actually put yourself forward for politics in the first place. So I need to get a lot of flack from time to time, but nobody that I know of ever went into politics to make Northern Ireland the worst place. I think they always went in to make it a better place, although inevitably in terms of the policies they pursue, sometimes some parties, I guess, do better than others. Can I just address one thing? Because one of the big things I think that's missing in our politics, and I think Phillip actually hit on it, where he said that we never really moved towards the politics of reconciliation, and I think that's absolutely right. Because we had a huge opportunity back in 1998 to actually build something very, very new and very fresh. And I work for a victims organisation. I work in peace building. Yes,
it's Alan McBride we're hearing from.
Yeah, I have delegations coming from all over the world coming to look at our peace process. And it's almost as though I think we should be investigated by the Department of Fraud, because I think it's fraudulent in terms of what we're selling them, because what we have now is not the vision that we had back in 1998. And if I could just speak maybe to Pádraig and to Phillip, because I do, and I'm going to say it, I've known Phillip for many years. I work with Philip's dad for many years. I have huge respect for him and for everything you stand for. But if I can just throw it back to both Sinn Féin and the DUP, because what I have seen is this absence of just being good neighbours, because what the Good Friday Agreement was built upon was this sense of being good neighbours. And what I've seen from your 2 parties has been the absolute absence of that. I mean, if I was wanting to reach out to my neighbour who was moving into my community and he wanted something to make him feel welcome, such as an Irish Language Act, for example, I would have given it to him in the morning. Absolutely, because that makes him feel at home here, it makes him feel welcome, it makes him feel that his culture is important. And for the same token, when I think of 2021, the 100th anniversary of Northern Ireland, and the fact that Sinn Féin wouldn't even concede to a rosebush being planted in Stormont, they wouldn't even concede to Belfast City Hall being lit up, to give something back to their unionist neighbours, is just unkind.
So, Alan, could I ask you to reduce that and condense it into one sentence, and that would be your question to both of them?
I want to see more kindness in our politics, and I suppose the question is, how can we get more kindness and more neighbourliness into our politics?
All right, Pádraig.
Well, Well, firstly, you'll know that Michelle's commitment as First Minister has been a First Minister for all. Actually, last June, was it, at the Jubilee celebrations, Michelle was present at those, as was I, as was our mayor in Derry, who is a mayor for all. What we want to do is to represent all communities. We're trying to do that. Every day, I'm talking to people from various backgrounds. So, I mean, I don't agree with your point on the fact that, you know, we haven't done that. I think that's invalid, to be honest. And I think that what we've done is actually to commit ourselves to being people who are going to work for everyone. That's my position. That's what I'm trying to do every day. I mean, I'm working with people right across the political divide, from all communities, on housing, on education, on welfare issues. So I don't accept that. No.
Phillip.
Thank you, and Alan, thank you for all the work you continue to do for the victim sector, and thank you for still letting me into the Duke of York on a Friday night, even though I'm not there. Thank you for still letting me in. No, Alan, you hit the point perfectly. You know, I was on Antrim and Abbey Borough Council for 10 years and had a really, really great working relationship with all our political colleagues. 98% of decisions were made unanimously, and it's something that I'm trying to work on in terms of I need to be better, and I think politicians need to be better at reaching out the hands of friendship across the divide. Because just because, you know, someone has a different political ideology to me doesn't mean that I shouldn't respect them, because all viewpoints in Northern Ireland are perfectly valid. Being friends with somebody who doesn't hold your political view is no bad thing, and I practice that in my personal life. It'd be a very boring life if I was just friends with people who shared my political outlook. But I am trying to be better at that and trying to encourage others to be better at that, because ultimately, whilst we all may have different political viewpoints and aspirations for where we want this place that we call home to go to, we all want to have the best for everyone that we're privileged to represent.
Now, yes, there's a lady here. Just wait for the microphone, if you would.
Good evening. I was born and raised in South Wales. I've lived in Belfast for 5 years now. And to be honest, the closest, if you could use the word close, the biggest reference that or understanding that I had of terrorism, in inverted commas, growing up in South Wales was the movement that was known as Maybe on Glyndŵr, or the Sons of Glyndŵr. And their bug was about people who came from other parts of the United Kingdom and bought holiday homes in various parts of Wales, which meant that the people who were indigenous to the area were growing up, getting married, raising families. They couldn't afford to buy housing because the people who were more affluent were coming in and buying up these properties.
So can I ask you what your question is?
Yes, sorry, I'm waffling. It's a Welsh thing. I wanted to address the question that you asked about which members of the panel had been educated about the Good Friday Agreement. And the quote that popped into my head was the one which I think is attributable to Winston Churchill, when he said, if you don't reflect on the past, you cannot look to the future. And I strongly think that young people of today should learn, the same as whether it's the Second World War or the First World War, not because you want to sort of glamorize it in any way or sensationalize it, but it happened, and it happened on these shores. And if they don't get taught about it and be given a capacity to analyse the reasons why, there's very real danger, in my opinion, that things being cyclical will happen all over again.
Yeah, thank you. Right, yeah, you've been patient. Okay, man in the front. Who else? Just so that because I'm going to take a couple now. Right, okay, I've seen you.
Yeah, yes, good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank the Lindhall Library and this wonderful place to host the event, and of course the panel, and of course yourself, Mr. Seamus McKee, for chairing this. I'm of a certain age that I remember you were sort of like a household face among the Northern Ireland media. Still are. Okay, still are. No, but I remember obviously Seamus McKee being one of the household names of political journalism in Northern Ireland. So it's good to see.
Thank you.
No problem, Seamus. Yes, no problem.
Shucks.
I would like to make two comments first, two brief comments and then a question.
Right.
And to give heads up to Carla and John, because I'm in particular very interested in what the SDLP representative and the Ulster Unionist representative have to say. First two comments about the Good Friday Agreement. One, if it wasn't for Cara's party and John's party, we wouldn't have a Good Friday Agreement. I think we've got to recognise that.
Okay. Second?
Second comment, yes, I'll be brief. Second comment, let's be honest, if Sinn Féin and DUP and the DUP were the biggest parties back then, we wouldn't have an agreement. So let's pay tribute to the Ulster Unionists and the SDLP. But my question is, Seamus, and I pay tribute to Kate's party, and in particular her leader, Naomi Long. Once she gets an idea into her head, as Kate will confirm, she sticks with it. She is now showing leadership and calling for the reform of the institutions in clear terms. So my question is, why don't the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists, the new generation of the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists represented by Cara and John here tonight, why don't you show leadership again in backing the Alliance Party in the request for reform?
Right,
because we've got the end of the DUP Sinn veto.
I'll get an answer in a minute. I think we've only time for one more, and then we'll have to wrap. I'm sorry, but we're running. Well, let me ask, how much more time have we got, folks? No, we haven't, right? It's usually a man in a brown house coat who's saying, I need to lock up. But in this case, it's some of my charming colleagues in the Linen Hall. Right, look, I think somebody at the back had a hand up, and yeah, you've got your chance. Yeah, just wait for the microphone and then we'll wrap it up. I'll give you a chance to answer his question.
I will be very short. I'm a French academic. I've been teaching Northern Ireland institutions the peace process for more than 30 years.
God love you.
And I must say, I'm very impressed by this roundtable discussion. The fact, well, I want to pay tribute to the organizer and to all the people present. I think it's really a feat to have, this meeting between all the different representatives, which I would have never heard of or would never imagined. Now, what I wanted to say is that talking about the Good Friday Agreement, as you said, someone said, oh, there has been no progress, there's been no improvement, there's still violence. But then the way I see it, and maybe I want to have your idea, is that it was an attempt to try and make things work. It has more or less failed or more or less succeeded, as you can see, but what she called the consociational model was applied. I think it was an idea of the European Union for a divided society. So my question would be, in order to make it evolve, to make it better, to improve it, to make things work, politically speaking, you would need a less divided society. And therefore, like you have black people see things in black and white, unionist, nationalist, and you have this, I would say, grey zone, but it's not derogatory at all, of the Alliance Party. And so how can you reconcile people who, some look west, some look east, some look south, and don't you think the idea would be if there was this center zone which expanded, then maybe the division between black and white wouldn't be so relevant.
All right. You know what? That's a whole other evening's discussion. But thank you very much. Right, a quick word, please, from the Ulster Unionists and the SDLP. John and Cara, why don't you back Alliance on reform?
Okay, just a couple of things to finish. I went to Cardiff University, I studied history, and I firmly agree that we absolutely must remember our past, and our children would be committed to repeating the failures of it if we didn't do it. I firmly agree that a lot of people did heavy lifting in 1998, but none more so, in my opinion, than the Ulster Unionist Party and the SDLP, and I know that the strain and pain that certainly David Trimble had to suffer on the back of that. And
will you back Alliance?
We'll get on to that. So we covered this in the discussion. Our party has said for a long time the institutions need to evolve and they need to be changed. I want to see a change in how opposition is funded, and I want to see how we set up mandates and how we commit to long periods of time to fund our departments. At the minute, though, I don't believe that we can enter into just picking and choosing what we're going to change in the middle of a crisis. It's never delivered anything positive in the past, and when we get back in and we're delivering together, then we should look at how the institutions change.
That's as much as you're going to get. And Cara.
Yeah, no, just to wrap up, thank you so much for your question. And just to touch on John's point, I think it is important to learn from our past. And for me, being a nationalist and seeing what the GFA granted us with self-determination, I want the opportunity to vote yes for a new future in my lifetime as well, just like my parents did with the Good Friday Agreement. But this time I want to do it in a new Ireland. But I'll take your question, and thank you for touching on the UUP and the SDLP's contributions. Again, the GFA is not a standalone agreement. I think we are absolutely open to conversations about reform and refreshing, because society is evolving, and with political frameworks like this, it's important at times that they do too. But we firmly believe that any changes or any reform must be done in the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, that spirit of optimism and hope and fairness.
Well, there you go, Kate. That's the challenge for not just you, but for all of you to take forward. What do you do in order that it's not pulled down again at the whim of one lot and at the expense of all of us? Okay, we'll have to stop there. You've been brilliant. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more, but can I ask you to show your appreciation for our panellists a minute?